Okay, so Lord of the Flies is kind of a weird book. It's about a bunch of boys who wind up stranded on an island. They are removed from society, civilization entirely. They have no parents, no authority figures, no institutions, no technology, no art, no culture. So none of the things that we would consider societal do they have. They're left with nothing. And they have to somehow take care of themselves and organize themselves in this state. This is precisely what William Golding wanted to explore when he wrote this book. When, at first no one wanted to publish his book. They were like, who wants to read a book about a bunch of kids stranded on an island? It's depressing. It's grotesque. No. And William Golding's response was that he wanted to explore what people were like when they were put in extreme situations. And this came to him because of what he'd experienced during war. If you remember, he made that statement about the fact that during wartime, all of us could potentially act as the Nazis act. And I think his point was that in an extreme situation, people behave differently than they do when in a civilized situation. So we're going to be looking at what a non-civilized state looks like, the state of nature. So during the Enlightenment, you had a bunch of philosophers who started to explore this question, the state of nature. So what do I mean by that? I mean the way humanity lived before entering into society. So philosophers started to gather together and ask themselves this question. They began to differentiate between humanity as social beings and humanity as instinctual beings, right? Oftentimes there's a conflict between how we want to behave and how we think we ought to behave. Sometimes there's a conflict between what we think the right thing to do is and what society says is the right thing. So these conflicts that come up started to generate questions about, what was humanity like prior to entering into a structured society? Would that tell us, what humanity is like at its core? Who we are outside of cultural influence. So, during the 1700s, some of these philosophers who did this thinking started to ask questions like, why did people join societies? So, what are the benefits of being part of a society as opposed to living alone? Is there a benefit to having to share your cave and your furs with other people, right? Why did they leave the state of nature? So why did we leave that animalistic, instinctual state and move towards a civilized state? And then, of course, they wanted to know what we would be like without civilization. In many ways, this is a purely theoretical question. There is no actual answer. It's doubtful whether or not humanity ever existed without some societal structure. If we look at intelligent animals who live in packs or family groupings, even they have a society of sorts. So when philosophers ask a theoretical question, it's called a thought experiment. It's this thought experiment that William Golding wanted to answer with his book. What would humanity be like if it was removed from civilization? Thus we have the Lord of the Flies. We've got a group of boys who are removed from society. How do they behave? How do they respond to this situation? So philosophers couldn't agree on the answer to that question. There were sort of two polarizing or opposite viewpoints about what the state of nature would look like. Is the state of nature good or is it bad? So are human beings instinctually good or are human beings instinctually evil? So one philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he argued that human beings in their natural state are essentially good. So in a state of nature, humanity is pure and moral, naturally empathetic and communal. So we share with each other, we're not prone to violence, we are cooperative by nature. This means then that the violence, the selfishness, the greed that we see in humanity is a result of society or civilization, not a result of our instinctual nature. Okay, so Rousseau's argument, natural human beings are good. Society, civilization brings out the worst in us. Thomas Hobbes disagreed. So he provides the opposite view, the antithetical view, in which humanity is instinctually or inherently evil. So in a state of nature, humanity is selfish, violent, naturally competitive, and independent. We don't share. Our instinct is to protect ourselves above others. We solve conflict through violence. So in Hobbes' thinking, then society and civilization prevent us from acting out on those bad impulses. Society and civilization provide a structured framework in which we can get along with each other, cooperate, and provide justice. Okay, so it's the opposite to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's take on human nature. So all of this is tied into the idea of Judeo-Christian religion. We read the story of the Garden of Eden, and I read it too for a reason, because the state of nature, the idea that humanity, did and can exist outside of society, is tied very closely to the story of the Garden of Eden. Within that story, you have the idea that humanity existed in some prior state, that we have not always been as we are now, that there was a time when humanity was essentially different than we are now, and that in the Garden of Eden specifically, in that prior time, humanity was better than it is now. So humanity lived without society, without civilization, right? They lived without clothes. They lived without shame. They didn't have family units. So you have a very instinctual human, almost more like an elevated animalistic creature, right? And that this creature lived in a sort of pure state. Then something changes, right? They disobey God. And so humanity winds up moving away from that state. They lose that state. They become knowledgeable, which I find interesting that, in the Garden of Eden story, knowledge is equated with that sense of evil, right? They now know enough to be ashamed of their nakedness. Suddenly, they're pushed into an agricultural state, right? They're told that as a punishment for their disobedience, they will have to practice agriculture, and that it's going to be difficult. So they're moving from a natural state to what we would say, and historians would say, is the beginning of civilization, right? What's interesting, though, about Rousseau's idea and Hobbes' idea is that they're both supported essentially by Judeo-Christian religion. And that's not surprising. Euro-Western philosophers and writers are going to be heavily influenced by Judeo-Christian religion. That was the entire infrastructure in which they thought. So the idea that we moved from a position of purity to a position of evilness supports Rousseau's philosophy that the state of nature is good. So this is prelapsarian. That's a word you'll probably never encounter again, but it's good for you to know. So prelapsarian is the state that humanity existed in prior to their disobedience in the Garden of Eden. Then we have original sin. Original sin is the idea that once Adam and Eve committed that sin, humanity was, henceforward, all humans were born in a state of evilness. So there was no purity anymore. This idea that humanity is born instinctually evil supports Thomas Hobbes' philosophy. And then finally we have the concept of the new world. The new world is the idea that God will eventually return us to the prelapsarian state. So we will be taken from our situation in original sin and returned to a position of purity. We essentially will be returned to a pure state of nature. Okay, so you've got prelapsarian. Before humanity was exiled from Eden, they lived a pure and harmonious life. There was no society and no sin. Since humanity has been exiled from Eden, all humans are born with inherent evil. They are born already sinful and desire to do wrong. This is the idea of original sin. Okay, then you've got the new world. So Judeo-Christians couldn't decide whether the new world was something that we would possibly discover on Earth. So a place where humanity was actually still living in a state of blissful nature, or if the new world was something that would be created in the future. Remember that this was when these philosophers were talking about these things, it was still unknown how much of the world was left to be discovered. For instance, when about 300 years prior to these philosophers, North America had just been found by Europeans. So, and there was questions at that time whether or not they had found the New World, a place where humanity had not experienced a fall from the pure state of nature into knowledgeable, sinful state. So what Golding does is he takes the island and he uses it as a thought experiment. The island is essentially, it's a new world, right? It's a place that he creates without civilization. So how are these boys going to behave in this place without society, without civilization? Okay, so you've got Ralph and you've got Jack as leaders. So Ralph, as a good leader, he wants to return to civilization. So whose state of nature does this reflect? It reflects Thomas Hobbes, right? In Hobbes' world, human nature is evil and civilization is good. It prevents us from acting on our bad impulses. Jack, as a bad leader, he wants to leave civilization. So whose state of nature does this reflect? Rousseau's, right? So humanity in its primitive state, to use that terminology, is good and civilization is bad. But now we get this flipped situation.